Protein is a pretty important macronutrient, and your body is made of protein. It needs it for repairing skin, building muscle, and producing some neurotransmitters. However, in the life extension community and anti-aging community, protein has gotten like a bad reputation, and eating too much protein is said to shorten your lifespan and accelerate aging. This video talks about, does protein speed up aging and how much protein? Protein restriction has been found to be linked with some longevity benefits, as well as the prevention of some diseases. This association is thought to be present even without calorie restriction, which is so far one of the only ways of knowing how to extend lifespan in all species. The main mechanisms for protein restriction on aging is downregulation of IGF-1 and mTOR, which are two anabolic pathways of growth. Although there is some cell studies and animal studies that show that protein restriction can be beneficial for longevity, there's no real data about humans, and it's not inherently accurate to correlate these animal studies to humans, because we're different species, and at the same time it's almost impossible to conduct these kinds of studies in humans as well, where you take this person and you put them on a high protein diet for the rest of their life, you quantify specifically how much protein are they eating, and then you compare it to someone else who's on a low protein diet and you see which one is longer. These kinds of studies, they would be impossible to make, and they would be also pretty unethical. And with the epidemiology, the epidemiology is very inaccurate. You don't really know what kind of protein do these people eat, how much, how often, etc., and what kind of other lifestyle factors contribute to their overall health. Protein is made of many different amino acids depending on the protein source. The main ones considered to affect aging and lifespan are leucine and methionine. They are quote-unquote anabolic amino acids that promote muscle protein synthesis and growth by turning on mTOR. Methionine restriction is thought to increase lifespan and slow down aging. Methionine restriction is also a potential strategy for cancer treatment and inhibition. Cancer cells need methionine to survive, as do all other cells, because methionine is an essential amino acid. A large 2016 meta-analysis demonstrated that calorie restriction combined with protein restriction had an identical effect on life extension as just calorie restriction without restricting protein. So eating less protein isn't the most important part to increase longevity when it comes to calorie restriction. Calorie restriction will work regardless of whether you're restricting protein or not. And protein restriction may mimic some aspects of calorie restriction without restricting calories. There are also many studies in which rodents who are under calorie restriction are fed a higher percentage of protein, including methionine, to keep it at the same level as those who eat without calorie restriction. With protein being matched, the rodents under calorie restriction still gain the benefits of calorie restriction and do better than the ones eating with no restriction. Restricting methionine is also very impractical and difficult because almost all foods contain some methionine. Of course, animal protein foods are higher in methionine than plant foods, but regardless, if you were to try to restrict methionine, then you may also experience muscle loss and frailty, as well as poor detoxification systems, because methionine is needed for producing antioxidants and that sort of thing. So even though you may be living a bit longer with methionine restriction and eating less protein, you're kind of suffering at the same time and reducing the quality of your life by being frail and losing your muscle tone. So the goal shouldn't deliberately be to practice calorie restriction or practice protein restriction. We have to just know what are the underlying mechanisms or pathways that get turned on when you are doing those things, and then we can mimic them. We can achieve the same results and same effects without necessarily having to eat a very low protein diet and losing muscle mass at the process. The main link is downregulation of mTOR and IGF-1, which are the two anabolic pathways of growth. Protein and methionine raise mTOR and IGF-1, but so does insulin and carbohydrates. So if you were to restrict something, then you would also want to restrict your insulin and carbohydrates. It has been found that low protein intake reduces IGF-1 levels and incidence of cancer in 65 and younger, but not older people. However, both high as well as low levels of IGF-1 are associated with cancer mortality in men. In fact, a meta-analysis of 12 studies with over 14,000 participants found that people with low levels of IGF-1 were at a 1.27 times the risk of dying, and those with higher levels were at a 1.18 times the risk. Lower levels of IGF-1 may actually be more detrimental as you age, as you'll be more predisposed to muscle loss and bone fractures. Studies find an association with low levels of IGF-1 and sarcopenia or muscle loss in older people. So although eating less protein does lower your IGF-1 levels and may reduce the risk of some cancers, you're also increasing the risk of osteoporosis and sarcopenia because of the lower protein intake and reduced muscle mass. And protein restriction isn't the only, and it's not even the best way of lowering IGF-1 levels. You can also lower IGF-1 levels with carbohydrate restriction, as well as doing some intermittent fasting or things like that. So you won't even have to restrict protein if you want to lower your IGF-1 levels. Another critical component to lifespan extension seen in methionine restriction and calorie restriction is autophagy, which is the process of cellular clearance. Restricting methionine in baker's yeast extends their lifespan, which was accompanied by an increase in autophagy. However, when autophagy genes were deleted, the extension in lifespan was also prevented. Autophagy is also central in the lifespan extension of calorie restriction. When autophagy is genetically mutated and blocked in mice, they don't live longer despite being fed fewer calories, whereas if autophagy is normal, they do live longer. So methionine restriction doesn't work if you don't have autophagy activated, and restricting methionine isn't gonna guarantee you autophagy either, because you can suppress autophagy with, again, like carbs and insulin. Autophagy is regulated most by mTOR and AMPK. Things that stop autophagy are insulin, glucose, and amino acids, as well as protein. Things that raise autophagy are fasting, calorie restriction, protein restriction, exercise, and low-carb diets. Now, I do agree that eating excess amounts of protein and eating too much protein can probably shorten your lifespan, and it's not the best thing to do in terms of your overall health. But at the same time, eating enough protein and eating a slightly higher protein intake can still have some quite good health benefits. Higher protein intake during dieting promotes weight loss, helps to maintain more muscle, and keeps the metabolic rate up. Compared with standard weight loss diets that have normal protein and low fat intake, high protein diets have been found to be more effective. Adequate protein intake prevents muscle loss or sarcopenia, frailty, and dependence on caretaking later in life. It's observed that muscle atrophy starts to occur even after the third decade of your life, with a 30 to 50% decrease between the ages of 40 to 80. Higher protein intake promotes bone health and reduces risk of hip fractures in old people. Falling and breaking bones is actually one of the biggest concerns related with aging, because it predisposes you to physical inactivity and further muscle loss, which in turn predisposes you to diabetes and other metabolic disorders. So how much protein should you eat then? The RDA for protein is about 0.36 grams per pound of body weight, which equates to roughly 40 to 60 grams of protein for average people. However, that amount is based on just meeting the bare minimal requirements for avoiding starvation. It's not considered adequate for people who are physically active or are engaged in some fitness. Research finds that the optimal intake for muscle building is around 0.8 grams per pound or 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight. The most you may get away with is like 1.2 to 1.5 grams per pound, but you definitely don't need more. To prevent sarcopenia, it might be better to get at least 1.2 grams per kilogram of body weight, and upwards to 1.6 to 1.8 grams per kilogram. A high protein diet may be harmful to individuals with kidney disease or impaired kidney function, but research doesn't find that a high protein intake causes kidney damage or is harmful to the kidneys in any other way. Glycine supplementation has also been found to have the same effects on life extension as methionine restriction. Glycine is found in organ meats, ligaments, drumsticks, and all of these bone broth parts. If you're eating meat, then you want to have less steak and more of these glycine-rich foods. In conclusion, I think that the research about protein restriction and aging can be just overblown, and it's definitely not, very accurate, or it can be very, it has its flaws and it's not complete. So you have to take into account many other factors like the eating frequency, what other things they do, how many carbohydrates they also eat, because that affects the mTOR pathway as well, in addition to protein. So yeah, like it's not just protein, it's the insulin, it's the carbs, it's the eating frequency, it's the overall calorie intake, and that sort of things. And if you were to be on let's say a high protein diet, then the best way to mitigate the potential side effects would be to do time restricted eating and intermittent fasting, because if you're eating only once or twice a day, then the overall stimulation of mTOR and IGF-1 would be lower compared to doing it over the course of 6 or 8 meals. So yeah, I think eating frequency is probably the most overlooked aspect to this, and it's much better to shorten your eating window a little bit to maintain this fasted state where you activate autophagy and you kind of compensate for the mTOR stimulation from eating slightly more protein.